Today we've got the Congresswoman representing Washington, D.C., Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
So first of all, the House has passed the bill for D.C. statehood, so congratulations. Now, obviously, the fight is far from over, and clearly this is an issue that's especially important to you. So when someone asks why D.C. should be a state, what have you found are the most persuasive arguments?
Probably the most persuasive argument, in fact, the argument that gets us some Republicans, is that district residents pay the highest taxes per capita in the United States and still don't have the same rights as others have. And that's what statehood would give us.
Yeah, I actually, that was one of the only arguments that I hadn't heard. So it's really interesting that you would say that. Now, D.C. statehood has been your issue forever, and it's actually passed the House before. But is this time different, and why?
Well, this is different. It's different because we have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president, all of whom support D.C. statehood. This is different for another reason. The Senate was late organizing or held up organizing over the filibuster. And indeed, Democrats got the Senate because Republicans would move no bills without the filibuster, or at least no significant bills. So that gave that House to the Democrats. So it's not for DC statehood, frankly, but if the filibuster goes for everything else, it will have to go for DC statehood as well. So I am very, very hopeful about our DC statehood bill.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, which is the obstacles that we're going to face in the Senate. So I'm not under any illusions that this thing is going to pass with 60 votes. And so speaking of the filibuster, even if we are able to reform the filibuster, there are still a few Democratic holdouts who haven't weighed in yet. And that includes Manchin, Sinema, Kelly, Shaheen, and King. This issue is your baby. Have you specifically lobbied or spoken to any of these people?
We're working on, look, we have got more than 90% of the Democrats. We really do not believe that if we get close to statehood that we won't get the remaining Democrats. In fact, I think the Senate is going to become even more Democratic in the next 2 years.
Yeah, especially we have states like Pennsylvania coming up, Wisconsin coming up, North Carolina. All of these states are ripe for the taking. So from your lips to God's ears. Now, Congresswoman Nancy Mace came out the other day and said this.
D.C. wouldn't even qualify as a singular congressional district, and here they are. They want the power and the authority of being an entire state in the United States.
What's your response to that?
Her response is that she ought to go back to school. The district is larger than 2 states that already have statehood.
Right.
So the qualifications of the district for statehood are not in doubt. All that is in doubt are the politics of the matter.
Why do you think Representative Liz Cheney, who's standing right behind her, didn't manage to say anything? You think it had something to do with the fact that her entire state of Wyoming that she represents has 150,000 fewer people than D.C.? You think that might have played a role?
Look, because she's a Republican, that's a short answer.
Yeah.
Wyoming and Vermont are the 2 states that are below us in residents, in the number of residents.
Mitt Romney weighed in too. He suggested that D.C. retrocede into Maryland as a compromise. What would be your response to that one?
There would be 2 responses. One is that Maryland gave the land to D.C. in perpetuity. That's the first response. It didn't just say, look, and we'll take it back when we get ready.
Right.
And the other response is that both senators and all of the Democratic members from Maryland support D.C. statehood. The only member from Maryland that doesn't support D.C. statehood is the lone Republican from Maryland.
I think it's ironic, too, to see, there's a big states' rights contingent on the right, and yet when it comes to issues national Republican issues, suddenly you have senators from Texas deciding that they want to overturn the election results in Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Suddenly you have the Republican senator from Utah deciding that that D.C. is going to retrocede into Maryland. It's funny how the states' rights party suddenly becomes a little less states' rights when it comes to issues that benefit them.
Yeah, they don't mind the big hand of the government when it comes to
Right.
issues that they support. That's why they don't have any credibility.
So one argument against statehood on the right is that D.C. wouldn't be able to sustain itself, that it would be the poorest state. Would D.C. be able to sustain itself?
It certainly wouldn't be the poorest state. The district has so many people moving into the district, we don't have enough room for them all. District is very prosperous at the moment. The district had a hard time way back in the day, but this is certainly not the case today.
Everyone is focused on D.C. over Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, for example. If we're successful with D.C., do we move on to other territories?
Well, we'd love to partner with Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico now has to decide whether it wants statehood. They have been divided on it. They have recent hearings there. If they decide, it'd be terrific to partner with them. I'm not sure that Puerto Rico would meet the old standard, one Democrat, one Republican. Their delegate is a Republican, but if the people of Puerto Rico were to vote, I'm not sure how they would vote with respect to political party.
One last question on this, and this strikes right to the heart of my OCD. What does a flag with 51 stars look like?
Actually, there have been tests on that, and I think, frankly, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the flag you have now. The star would be placed in such a way with only one additional star that you'd have to look very closely to find out you had a new state. We'd be able to find it, though.
I think it's something that I'd have a hard time with, but I think I'd be able to overlook it if it meant that we can get statehood for DC. So I do want to switch gears here to the Derek Chauvin case. This past week, we saw Derek Chauvin get convicted of murder for the killing of George Floyd. So what does this mean moving forward? Does this mean that Derek Chauvin was so blatantly guilty, and the fact that there was video and entire countrywide protest, that his conviction was a one-off, or does this actually signal a sea change that could lead to actual systemic reform?
Well, I fear it could be a one-off. The reason I fear it is because of the conviction of Chauvin this week, or this past week, or during this week, I think, almost could not be avoided. It was an eyewitness for the world to see. So unless you didn't see what you saw, he had to be convicted. I'm not sure what that does for us when it comes to most of the convictions that will be outstanding in the future on police officers.
Yeah. Well, was this...
If that's what it takes, that's more than we'll have.
Yeah.
Perhaps again. Although I must say, social media does give us a new way to perhaps get the kind of evidence we couldn't get before.
This was kind of a combination of every factor that really made it impossible not to convict him. I mean, you had entire worldwide protests about this one case. I mean, honestly, if a conviction couldn't be found on this case, then that would have, So while I know that this was one instance of accountability, there's clearly still a need for systemic change. I know negotiations are ongoing for the Justice and Policing Act. Do you have any update on the progress of that?
Well, of course, the bill is held up on qualified immunity. And that, of course, means that it's difficult to convict a police officer. Of course, Chauvin shows us maybe you can, because the good faith defense has been outstanding. The defense that the officer thought what he was engaged in was lawful, and there is compromise, not language, but the one black senator in the Senate is trying to compromise on this matter. I think the qualified immunity notion is very troubling. It makes it almost impossible to convict a police officer unless we have the Derek Chauvin matter before us.
Right.
And that's what we won't have most of the time.
Right. right? This overwhelming avalanche of evidence against somebody that the entire world knows is true. Is this issue of qualified immunity, is this what Republicans are basically looking to take out? And is this a red line for Democrats?
Democrats are trying not to make it a red line because we want this bill so bad. That's why there are, as I speak, negotiations going on, because we want the George Floyd Act out.
Right, totally. Well, good luck to you as you continue to fight for statehood, and to the people of DC in their fight for representation. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.